Hi, this is the view from my window. Like most of the world for the last year, I spent a lot of time just looking outside, trying to understand what's going on. I'm Dave McCoppin. G'day, I'm coming to you from Sydney, Australia today. This is the window from the back of the apartment that I'm living in at the moment. The view is great, but views are also about the way in which we see the world. And this year, we've learnt to see the world slightly differently. So I want to talk to you about that today. Let me just change the background a little bit while I help you focus on something. Think about a typical conversation today anywhere around the world. And I'll guarantee you that at some time in every Zoom call you make, in every Teams meeting you have, in every phone call, in every messenger that you send out to family and friends, at some point you come up with, how are you coping? And sometimes you, or the person on the other end, will respond with, well, I am coping, I guess, whatever that means today. Because coping has changed. What we mean by coping has changed. Family, work, life, coping is different to what it was just 12 months ago. Now, preparing for today and thinking about this topic, like always, I Googled coping in times of COVID, coping in Asia, because that's where I primarily work, how people are coping. There's a lot of presentations, there's a lot of material being developed this year about coping, mostly related to stress and the way in which we are coping with personal stress. Just this week, the Global Wellness Institute has launched a new report on mental wellness around the world and what it means and what people are doing about it. Because mental wellness has been part of coping and the way in which we are trying to cope. What I wanted to do today was to just spend the next 20 minutes or so talking to you about some of the things I've been learning through all sorts of different pieces of research, formal and informal, about coping and some of the aspects of how we're coping and how that affects us in maybe rethinking some things around family, work and life. A friend of mine in Sri Lanka came up, designed this little graphic, probably around May or June this year. It says, a turning point to humankind in decades, COVID-19. It took the world by a few years in advancement in technology adaptation and took lifestyle back a few years to simpler times. Much needed break for the fast-paced lifestyle of mankind and a better break for Mother Earth. What this was all about was the fact that as we've talked about things like the new normal or the now or whatever way you want to talk about the way in which the world has developed and changed in the last 12 months, we're actually just talking about things speeding up a bit. Things that we mostly have seen coming have sped up. Some things, though, are surprising, and I'll come to a few surprises. But mostly it's about us coping, not particularly changing dramatically, but coping with change, coping with little things that perhaps we saw were going to happen. Perhaps we've been saying, that'll happen in 5 or 10 years, and it happened very quickly. And this coping and learning to cope has been perhaps the major thing that's come out of this year. It affects insight, it affects how we think about businesses in the future and how businesses are having to react to people. Coping, for example, balcony culture. We saw in the early days of the COVID pandemic in Europe, the whole idea of balcony culture coming back through to the surface. Now, balcony culture is not new. If you go back 50, 60, 100 years, people sat on their balconies, on their front steps, etc., and communicated. We sat there, I can remember as a child, sitting there, communicating with the people sitting on their verandas next door and across the road in the little outer suburbs of Sydney where I grew up. Coping by slowing down and rediscovering our humanity, by just staring out the window, spending a lot more time maybe just chatting across the balcony or across the road to neighbours, coping by just slowing down. But unfortunately, windows can be a luxury. It's okay for me. I normally live in a big apartment in Bangkok. I have 5 small balconies that look out over gardens, etc. It's great. I come down to Sydney about 10, 11 weeks ago. I'm staying at my daughter's apartment. As you saw, I have balconies and windows that look out over gardens. It's fantastic. Time to relax, to look out, to take in the world, to have a think. But not everybody can do that, because where I live in Asia, a lot of people just don't have those sorts of windows and those sorts of balconies and those sorts of luxuries of space. Now, we've seen a lot of research that tells us that self-isolation, for example, well, perhaps is a little bit more difficult in some Asian countries than in the West. This particular study refers to Hong Kong, South Korea, and Japan as finding it much more difficult, the red bars, to live in self-isolation. And that's due to social circumstances, to the way in which work is structured, to the way working in offices has been structured. These were countries that weren't really gearing up for a work from home type relationship. But think about it beyond those developed Asian countries. Think about it in the broader context. These are the conditions in which many, many Asians live. On the left, Hong Kong. On the right, Bangladesh, Dhaka. These are crowded cities, very crowded cities, in which people are really close to each other, in which many of these people don't have jobs to go to in offices. They are day labourers, day workers, etc. It's estimated that in the city of Dhaka, when the government first said, let's close in and everybody work from home, that up to 3 million people left within the first 48 to 72 hours to go back to their villages, because they literally couldn't self-isolate. They couldn't work from home because they don't work at home. They can't do their work at home. And that's true in the city I live in, Bangkok, and many, many other Asian cities, where as we closed down, we had to learn to cope. Many people had to learn to cope by moving away from home, back to traditional villages or back to their traditional family homes, etc. Basically because, well, they couldn't shut down. I'm reminded of some comments that a friend of mine, Gulsel Shawan, who is the managing director who runs Braid, one of the biggest advertising agencies in Bangladesh. Early on in the whole COVID scenario, he and I were on a webinar together, and he made a couple of really good points. Before designing a communication for coronavirus, we must understand how we are as people and what are the cultural norms we believe and practice. And somebody, well, what does that mean? He said, well, think about work from home. It's now a global term. Fantastic. Self-distancing is for many a mantra that will be hard to break. But unfortunately, these are Western elitist ideas. It's okay in Europe or North America, in developed marketplaces, to suggest, even in places like Japan and Korea, where you could sort of force fit these things beyond what is normal social things and say, you can cope because we can change things to try and help you cope. But in many parts of Asia, the whole idea of social distancing is not only not part of the cultural norm, it's just extremely difficult to do, physically to do. And so we've had to have marketplaces learning to cope with change like that. Now, it's significant that Shawan's agency, Grey, has, in the last 12 months, been winning a lot of awards for a particular campaign they did called Agro Banking, which brought together one of the biggest banks in Bangladesh and one of the biggest supermarket retail chains in Bangladesh to create a whole new banking system for those people that were living outside of the cities that don't have access to, for example, smartphones. Many of them don't have the internet at all, access at all to the internet. And yes, please remember, 48% of the world's population don't have access to the internet. What this campaign is really famous for is the fact that it solved a way in which farmers could actually be part of a system in which they could deposit leftover produce in the bank and it's converted to cash. Now, what's really important that in COVID times and coping, this was two different organisations, a bank and a retailer, helping people cope with the need to do something different to gain cash. And one of the interesting things is the way in which brands and companies this year around Asia and around the world are trying to adapt to things and learn to cope with different types of scenarios that perhaps we really hadn't put a lot of thought into up until this year. Think about masks. In Asia, masks are about being part of a culture. It's part of the community, it's part of caring. It's taken for granted. This photo actually is not from 2020. This photo is from SARS in Hong Kong in 2002. I happened to live in Hong Kong in 2002 during SARS. We all took up wearing masks. It had already been a practice in many parts of Asia to wear masks during the flu season, during the cold season. When you felt you had a cold, you wore a mask to protect others. And I think that's one of the things that we've learned this year in terms of coping, is the way in which different cultures have thought about masks and masking. That masks are about protecting others and protecting the world just as much or maybe even more than protecting yourself. But that's a very Asian type concept, if you like, where it's a concept built around cultures that are really built about cultures of community and caring. Now, masking has also led us down the pathway of the two big I's. Everybody in the world has coped in some way through either introspection and or indignation. We see that in all sorts of ways as we look at research and the way in which people are reacting. Introspection, in terms of the way in which more and more people are posting, thinking, just looking out the window and considering what is there to life? How much more have we been missing? How much more could we be doing? It's the introspection about thinking about what's happening with the environment, perhaps. It's the introspection of thinking about how much is life really worth. It's the introspection about thinking about our communities. But that's also, at the same time, as we introspect, as we think more and more, it's also led to indignation. Not the indignation of having to wear a mask. You know, anybody that's really concerned about forcibly wearing a mask really isn't thinking too hard. The indignation comes because we've had a lot more time this year to just sit around and think. We always say, well, you know, I'm going to put on too much weight, or I'm going to watch too much Netflix, etc. But we forget about the fact that this year maybe we just all sat around and just stared at walls, stared out of windows, stared off our balconies, stared out of windows and thought about the things that trouble us. And that's led to some of the indignation. Yes, protesting against the confinement of COVID, about some of the regulations, getting fed up with not being able to go out, but also some of the bigger issues, as we're seeing in Thailand, for example, at the moment, as different groups of people have spent time thinking, and it's bubbled to the surface more about, let's go out and think about what we're going to do about the future. Of course, one of the big things that's happened this year in the way we cope is the use of smartphones and the way in which we're using phones and phone-based technologies to cope with being shut in, to cope with not being able to shop, to cope with getting to services, to entertainment, to be able to cope with being able to stay in contact with everybody we know. Now, again, in the Asian context, remember, in many Asian countries, smartphones are perhaps not only the primary, but the only digitally based device that many people in many homes have access to. So everything is happening over a smartphone. In places like Myanmar, where something like 85+% of the population have a smartphone but have never owned a real phone, a landline, and have never owned a computer. They've just literally done everything, as far as they're concerned, that we might think of computer services or digital services over a phone. But this adaptation this year, the fast-paced coping by quicker adaptation of all sorts of services, has really changed the way we think about the come-to-you economy. It's a quite new term. It's a term of 2020, the come-to-you economy. The fact is that we expect every category to come to you. Yes, there will be some return to the old days in the future. We will, in the old ways, we will always like going out shopping. We like the interaction. We like the ability to go and just smell and feel and do things. We like just going for a walk at shopping malls or walking around a store. It just feels good. But at the same time, the level of experience and trust in these solutions has risen dramatically. And it's led to all sorts of things, e-medical services, things that we were talking about last year in 2019, where I do a lot of work in the pharmaceutical and health industry. And we were talking about e-services becoming really big in 5 and 10 years' time. And now all over Asia, they're normal. You get your pills delivered to home. You go online, you order it on your phone, it comes delivered. E-medical services, e-advisory services, et cetera, et cetera. It's all becoming normal. It's how we're coping. And as we're doing that, we're looking at more and more of those sorts of supplementary services that we get over our phone. Things like work from home and health productivity type advice. More advice from hospitals or health facilities about how to cope with things by getting downloads, apps, etc. How to work well from home during the coronavirus through different types of services through our phones. This is all part of the way in which we've changed the way we cope with a different sort of world through our mobile devices. We've also come to think more about wellness. Wellness has been maybe the fastest growing big industry in the last 10 years. The Global Wellness Institute tells us that it's now worth about $5 trillion globally, and it grows at about 10% a year, no matter what. This year, it's still growing at around 10% a year. It's moved in some research that I've been doing using a particular AI-based research tool called Significant Systems that lets me look at all the content on the internet and judge what are the narratives about any particular subject and where they sit. We can see that wellness is moving from a timeless narrative, something that we've always sort of had there, to a transformational narrative. In 2020, in COVID times, in the times of coping, wellness becomes not something that we do automatically, but something that we're looking for more from, that we're expecting more from, and that we're hoping can help transform our lives to something better. Now, it's also surrounded by so many positive traits. When you do the analysis on the narrative around wellness, what you find is that the most common sort of language used around wellness is enthusiasm, expectation, hope, calmness, joy, love, compassion. These are the things that are driving wellness and that we're reacting to. It's how we're coping with the world by trying to get more well. Of course, we do a lot of research into what wellness means. One of the things I did this year was to use that Significant Systems platform to do a study with some partners into 150 narratives around wellness issues to find out which were the most important, which ones were really transforming the way in which we think about wellness, and which wellness narratives will be the ones that really affect us the most going forward. Here's the top 10, and you'll notice the top 3 are food quality and nutrition, healthy skin and wellness, gut health and wellness. Now, these are really important because these are 3 very physical things that are related to what we can see and feel about ourselves. The way in which we cope, and we've been coping this year, is partly by feeling good, trying to feel good, trying to take care of ourselves a little bit better, watching what we're eating, looking at the effect it's having on our physicality. Take gut health, for example. Gut health is so important as we think about the way in which we live life. But what's happened is that in 2020, gut health has gone through the roof, if you like. It creates a lot of anxiety. The subject, the narrative gut health, creates a lot of jitteriness, anxiety, concerns, some dislike, but it also creates a lot of love as we discover new ways we can cope with gut health. Most importantly, there's a lot of expectation and hope around gut health and wellness. Again, coping in 2020, in part, is about looking at ourselves and looking at the subjects that we think can help prevent disease, prevent ourselves maybe catching the dreaded big COVID, but also about longevity and about ongoing health and wellness. And gut health and wellness is one of those attributes. So I encourage you, if you think about it, to think about things like food quality, nutrition, gut health. Healthy skin and wellness as a representation of what are the things that we should be focused on to say, hey, we're coping with all of this through those attributes. Now, one of the things about gut health and about food and nutrition is, of course, we've been living more more with delivered food, but we've seen the dramatic rise of healthy delivered food. Brands like HelloFresh and what they're doing to really help people in many countries rethink cooking, how to cook, learning how to cook, but what are great ingredients, and our demand for great ingredients, for fresher food, for better quality nutrition is also part of the way in which we've coped. Unfortunately, the downside of that is that we've all ended up with thousands and thousands of plastic containers. And so expect that the way in which we will cope with this will be to demand, hey, how can we have all this great food, but not so much of a mess afterwards? Of course, the big trend has been working from home. Working from home has been the biggest concern. Ups and downs of working from home, some happier, some frustrated, more work or less, it's all very difficult. Adjusting to mental and physical wellness has become a key part of the way in which we work from home. In fact, work-life balance has gone through a big change. We've been tracking, again, using the same platform, we've been tracking this subject all year. And what we can see is that there's great joy at working from home, but there's also fear, because one of those things, work-life balance is being affected in those two terms. The more we're working from home, sometimes the more our life is being affected in a negative way. So, for example, when we tracked a whole bunch of key attributes across this year, one of the things you can see here is the affected states, belonging, optimism, etc. Look at the top, that's the positive attributes. The bottom is the negative attributes that are connected with work-life balance. You can see they've grown dramatically this year and are staying very broad and very deep, because work-life balance is really affected by work from home in many negative ways. Let me explain. What do you miss most? Here's a little quiz that a friend of mine, Vanessa Oshima, and I put together for a different presentation a couple of weeks ago. But think about this. Do you miss daily commute time? Do you miss coffee smoking breaks? Do you miss structured work days and hours? Surprisingly, in my research across Asia, I'm finding that people do miss these things. For example, they're missing what we called CID, casual ideation deprivation. Those brief moments, those 5 to 10 minutes when you had a coffee break, maybe with colleagues, when you had a smoking break downstairs with not only your own colleagues, but people from a different department, or maybe a different company, or maybe the people that work across the road that share the same smoking space. And you have those little conversations that sometimes just spark ideas. Hey, what are you doing today? Oh, well, I'm working on this. Oh, have you ever thought about that? Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. Those moments are really being missed. DCD, daily commute distraction. Here's the thing, if you'd asked people 12 months ago, do you miss commuting? No, no way, right? Of course I hate commuting. In the 10 largest cities in Asia, I discovered the average person commutes for nearly 2 hours each way every day, nearly 4 hours commuting every day. People hated it. Now they miss it. Now they're saying, I'm missing it because it was a time, it was my third place, if you like. It was a time for myself. It was a time maybe when I read or daydreamed or listened to music or listened to my favorite radio, or maybe just stared into space and did nothing. It was a downtime, but it was also a downtime where in the back of my head, ideas were floating. And I'm not getting that anymore because the commute doesn't exist when you work from home. Actually, all that matters is what happens then is you spend that extra 4 hours doing more work, and that's deeply worrying. And then that's connected to the space. People are missing the space of the office. Now, yes, typically Asian offices are not luxurious. They're crowded, big open areas, but lots of people, lots of stuff crowded in them. But the truth is that sometimes, as one person said to me, going to the office meant a touch of luxury. A small personal space, but an open big area, air conditioning, modern facilities. I'm not stuck in my matchbox of a little apartment. And for many people in many big Asian cities, they're missing the actual space that comes with going to the office and that regimen of getting that space every day. So think about that. Are you missing those things? And then think about these 4 things about the way in which we cope. The first way in which we cope with COVID and other disasters and other problems is fear. You mean people are dying? What can I do? Who can I help? What do we need to do? Those sorts of responses. Is your brand ready? Are brands ready to help? Do you understand the role you can play in helping people cope with that fear? Desperation. From we better overstock on toilet paper, ha ha ha, to where can we hide from all of this, to I'm going to search for everything and listen to anybody to get the help I need because I'm feeling a bit desperate. So you have to ask yourself, is your brand helping people cope by being a helper, a fixer, or maybe you're a distraction brand? Maybe sometimes the role of your brand is to help people cope by just giving them a bit of a laugh, a bit of fun, something to distract them from the stress and the need to get away from being desperate. Active change. Staying at home, working from home, creating our own little universe of safety in these four walls to I'm going to follow the YouTube cooking class, buy more fresh food, eat better. So I have to learn to cope with homeschooling, home working, home entertainment, home exercise, a whole new lifestyle. As people look to change their lives, do you or do the brands you work with, are they changing the role they play in people's lives? And are they helping them learn how to actively change those lives? And the fourth coping thing is coping with difference itself. I have to find the right sources of information. Think about this year. We've all turned to the internet more and more. We've all turned to Google and Facebook and all sorts of sources on the internet to help us get information, but then we've also questioned that more and more. So it's going from trying to find the right sources to actually some of this seemed tough, but I'm learning more about myself and maybe making some changes in my life to understanding which brands really were or are trying to help me and which are just playing a game to sell stuff and look good. So there's that coping with the difference and coping with myself and change. And for each of the above brands of all kinds, need to make changes and decide where they fit and which questions they are answering. This has all come from research I've been doing in Bangladesh, Thailand, Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore over the last 9 months. If you want to know more about, you can ask me all the questions you like in the next 15 minutes or so, or just get in touch with me. Thank you.